Hello, everybody. Substack land. Back again. This is another in a series of really interesting conversations or authentic dialogues, as I like to call them, with interesting people who have some kind of perhaps a spiritual orientation in their work and some unique approach to service and relationship. So, Jeff Carolin is here with us today. And welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
So glad that you are able to be with us and share some of your experience and wisdom. Um, so, you are a defense lawyer, you have practiced um, and education from York University in Toronto, Osgoode Hall, and School of Law. And also, you have a certificate from the Simon Fraser University in BC in
Restorative justice.
restorative justice. Yeah. So I was gleaning your website, which is really interesting, and I just kept going from page to page of wow, and there's more, and there's more.
Wow. Yes.
You're a multifaceted human being, and um, maybe a bit of a Renaissance man. I think, which in this day and age can be a very good thing, um, because the world really is coming together, whether it wants to or not.
Mhm.
um, Consciously at least. So it's inevitable, inexorable, the unity of mankind. Yet there are still many forces in our society and belief systems which are dragging that process, to say the least, and making it very challenging. And we can see that there's a kind of a polarization increasing in our society as well, right and wrong, left and right, and so many dichotomies. So one thing that caught my eye was that in your practice and in your work, there was a kind of an interest and a compassion for demographics or populations that are marginalized, and that you were attracted to helping your clients who were people of color, LGBTQ, and so on. Could you talk a little bit about your affinity with people who may be oppressed or outside the norm in their uh, receiving of social justice?
Sure. Um, First of all, thank you for having me on your podcast or your podcast. I guess it's your video cast. It's really nice to be here. It's been nice to connect with you, Hugh.
Yeah, you too.
My perspective, I mean, that was like, particularly in my criminal defense work, which I did for 11 years. I really wanted to support the people who I felt um, were marginalized sort of by society. And in addition to what you named, definitely mental health and mental health difference was a big part, as well as poverty. So the vast majority of my clients were poor. Um, and I heard another criminal defense lawyer put this once, for a state that neglected people at so many moments in their childhood in terms of resources, in terms of, how to help people through like childhood development in a good way. And then when the sort of repercussions of that kind of trauma manifesting over time into maybe some kind of violence, now the state's really invested in policing, prosecuting, and jailing.
Hmm.
And there was something about that that never sat well with me. And so I happen to have the fortune of certain kinds of like, I guess, academic ability in terms of like being able to be the lawyer, a significant financial support from my parents in doing so, and really wanting to contribute that privilege and kind of put it to bat for someone who I felt was really in need of it. And I don't want to make it sound totally transactional. I also found that the relationships that I had with my clients, in some ways, it made the work harder because I really developed a deep relationship with a lot of my clients and really trying to understand their stories and their experiences. It did help me defend them better, but at the same time, it also, I think, enhanced me as a person to sort of just increase my understanding of other people who had lived, it was all based in Toronto where I grew up, and just like how many different Torontos there are, based on what kind of context you're born into, and something that none of us can choose, right?
Very
And
much so. Yeah.
that work was very meaningful for me. Ultimately, I pivoted away from it, which I can share more about why. But
Yeah.
being, yeah, just it was sort of that combined with a view that I had formed over time that I just don't think that jails can be the only answer to when something bad happens, when there's violence, when there's harm. Um, I don't think personally it's like much of an answer for anything. There's evidence that jails cause crime as
Mhm.
opposed to actually stopping it. There's a lot of fundamental assumptions that simply aren't borne out about deterring people from behavior. That's a whole other story that
Yeah,
we don't necessarily need to get into, but it was sort of that conviction plus a bit of a pun there. That conviction that prisons weren't a great social system combined with wanting to go to bat for people that drove me, like led me into doing that work.
yeah.
Plus a
Well,
brief experience of incarceration myself during a political protest,
I was
which I
just going
guess I
to
should
I
add.
was just going to mention that that was about
Yeah,
15 years ago, right?
15 years
During
ago, yeah.
the G8.
GHG 20 summit when they were held in Toronto
Yeah,
and north of Toronto, yeah.
yeah, that was. I remember that. It was really something. Wow. So I gave you a little taste of the inside.
Yeah, and it was, brief though it was, and but it was about 22 hours in this like makeshift lockup with
Mhm.
a small cage with 26 men in it. It was a very intense experience.
Right.
Um, and it was, I actually, before that I was in law school at the time. I'd been interested in doing refugee work actually and
Mhm.
wanting to support people who had come here for whatever reason. And then after
Mhm.
that, I became very interested in criminal defense work.
Mhm. The indigenous First Nations culture, and um, they believe when they have a chance, distributive justice, perhaps, um, to not to have offenders go to prison, if possible, but to meet with the elders in the community and really speak from their heart as much as they can, and to be seen and to be heard, and to have the wisdom of the whole community come to some kind of a decision about their process of repaying their debt, but not being locked up. Some kind of community service, perhaps, and then checking in every month, every week, whatever. Is that a model that appeals to you, or that
Well,
somehow could be workable in the larger society?
I mean, definitely that I think what started leading to my shift more towards what I'm doing full time now, which is uh, some of that, what I would call that restorative justice. Um, and it was in 2017 where I realized that like sort of playing off what you said earlier about the sort of polarization, left, right, right, wrong, the polarization that happens within the criminal justice system is very extreme. You're in, you're out, you're guilty, you're not guilty, you're the complainant, you're the
Mhm.
accused. There's no room for nuance. There's no room for the fact that, my client may have hurt someone on one day, but likely was hurt, himself another day. And same thing for complainants, that they've lived their own lives and experiences and
Mhm. Mhm.
aren't just defined by quote unquote being a victim or being a survivor.
Mhm.
And the level, like especially when we go into trial mode, it's just right or wrong. You're doing everything to like minimize your own client's responsibility and maximize the other, and vice versa. And I think that led, being in that adversarial kind of environment, led to like an internal splitting in me of almost like having to some inner part of me that I think has always had like a peacemaker, mediator kind of sort of spirit or mentality, and I realized like I had a real mental health decline about 6 years into practice, and I had come across uh, restorative justice practices and indigenous forms of kind of like how to deal with crime and violence and before law school, and I'd kind of forgotten about it. Obviously, it's not my background or context. I'm Jewish, Eastern European sort of background. I didn't learn about that. And so it kind of came in, and then I was like, okay, now I got to be the best criminal defense lawyer within the system that I can be.
Mhm.
And then I returned to it in that moment, and the sort of what I understand to be the non-binary aspect of it, as you just described so well, really drew me and inspired me. And that's when I started moving that direction. And I really, the two traditions in particular that have really inspired me. One is what's, Indigenous justice, restorative justice. And obviously there's many that reflect the different communities' traditions, but yes, something that's more oriented to relationships
Yeah.
and seeing violence and harm as a sort of like impact on relationships. And then how can we repair and restore?
Mhm.
And then also a Black feminist tradition, and which also has roots in the disability justice community around transformative justice.
Mhm.
How do we support our communities that where we feel like in these communities feeling like they can't go to the police for justice
Hmm.
as like an additional issue beyond sort of the binary aspect of it. And so, yeah, all of that really inspired me to see within the criminal justice system what might be possible in terms of other
Hmm.
ways
Hmm.
and what might be possible outside of it. And that sort of led me doing more and more work in workplaces, actually, where there's just more flexibility to take the real tough issues that impact people, harassment, discrimination, a sense of human rights violations, and rather than taking almost like the criminal law approach of investigations and adversarial and statements, trying to do a conflict transformation work. So that's sort of been the arc, and the restorative
Right.
practices and principles were definitely the like jumping off point from the criminal defense stuff into the
Yeah.
work I'm doing today.
So there's been a shift. Well, it's so refreshing and nurturing even to listen to your words, Jeff, because the mainstream media especially is just so full of this anti-woke ideology and really woke has become a dirty word. Even South Park can say that wokeism is over, but it's alive and well. I was just thinking you are the okay and woke.
No,
uh,
I mean it's interesting. I'm
Silly
curious.
joke, but yeah,
Yeah, no, I feel like many people would identify me as woke, and based on
yeah.
my understanding of it, I think that makes sense. And I guess what I would add is that a big influence on me is Kazu Haga's work, who's since become a friend, and he is trained in the sort of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. legacy of nonviolence.
Yes.
And to me, that's the kind of like sort of social justice, social change,
Mhm.
woke approach that makes the most sense, which does have this idea of beloved community, and
Mhm.
that we don't end up with peace and justice on this planet until, at least in some broad sense, we see each other as part of the same community. And so there are times when, and my approach is to have empathy for everyone, all movements, really trying to understand
Mhm.
why people do what they do,
Yeah,
whether it's left, right,
yeah,
center, abstaining from politics, or whatever it is.
right.
Um, and so for the people who I feel more aligned with generally tend to be more like progressive left social movements, there are also times where the strategies used do seem to create an other, even if if it's often in a reaction to feeling other themselves or as a group.
Yes.
And to me, it's like, and to acknowledge that and have empathy for that, and maybe that is the right approach. Look, if I knew what would bring about a better context for everyone, I had a crystal ball, I would do it.
Right.
But for me, what makes most sense is to root whatever we might call woke ideology, but in like wanting space for everyone, no matter who you are and what you've done. And to me, that's what I consider that approach to
Mhm.
be. And it doesn't always maybe look like that or feel like that. And I think that's something to think about.
On that note, that the book that you mentioned on your website by Kazuhaga,
Mhm.
Healing Resistance: A Radically Different Response to Harm, and also there was a sentence or a question on your website that sort of piqued my curiosity, which was, how can we center the needs of the person who has been harmed without disposing of the person
Yeah.
who caused harm? And I'm thinking, my mind jumped because I met you at a summit of um, standing together in Toronto at the Reference Library, which was an amazing event with Palestinians and Jewish citizens of Israel and many Jewish people from Toronto and some Palestinians as well, discussing this huge
Yeah.
conflict, we'll call it. And so I immediately went to think, well, how in that scenario, how can that question be applied? How can we center the needs of the person or the people, the group that is being harmed without disposing of the person or group who's doing the harm?
Mhm.
So if you could maybe just how it was used on your website, what did you intend, and maybe how you might extrapolate and apply it to like,
Sure.
yeah,
Simple question, right?
yeah,
Um, yeah, I can share that. I mean, I guess maybe just for context for people listening to this,
yes,
I grew up in the Toronto Jewish community. I grew up with a very particular story about Israel, and I say Israel only because I did not grow up with a story about Palestine.
right,
And very much the story I received was, as a European, someone of European Jewish background, his centuries of discrimination, persecution, culminating in the Holocaust,
Yeah.
and the Zionist the sort of modern political and at the time mostly secular Zionist movement actually being one of many solutions that was being or strategies that the Jewish communities there were adopting to try to like for safety for themselves. So there was like become socialists,
Yeah.
that movement, there was like a Bundist movement of like here-ness. We should make here better for us and for everyone, a sort of like broader collective workers, sort of working class perspective. There was go to North America or Turtle Island, just
Hmm.
flee, set up shop there. And then there was go to Palestine.
Yeah.
Um, and that I grew up with the story that Israel, therefore, like in the darkness, after the darkness of the Holocaust, there's like the miracle of Israel. And what I wasn't told about was what I now think of as the darkness of effectively a stateless people post World War II Jews, creating then another stateless people as a result of their
Yes.
uh, pursuit of their own goals and safety. And that obviously, I think we're witnessing sort of a culmination of that movement. And I hope something's going to change because I mean, I find the whole thing heartbreaking and devastating for all the people of Gaza, the West Bank, and also for Israeli Jews. It's like I feel like I can have place in my heart, and the Jewish community here and the Palestinian diaspora, like place for everyone in my heart.
Hmm.
In terms of how it connects to that event and these other principles, um, it's very controversial. I won't lie to you about like what the strategy is,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
definitely am in community with people who the strategy is to make this violence in Gaza, particularly and elsewhere, stop is isolate the Israeli state, the Israeli government, sanction it, boycott, divest, sanction movement, and so on, and really just like make it so obvious how objectionable what it is that they're doing that they'll have to stop, and then something better can happen. And most of the people I know actually hold a shared view that I do of like, what does it look like for there to be equality, dignity, justice, democracy for everybody who's between the river and the sea,
Hmm.
in the land, if that term. It's maybe
Right.
not everybody's favorite term, like in the land,
Yeah.
in that geography.
Okay.
But how do you get there? And so I'm sympathetic to that approach. And also in terms of my other alignments, it's not the most intuitive to me or the one that makes sense. And so movements like Standing Together, the Gaza Youth Committee, there's definitely people in the West Bank who are trying to like picture that future and what does that look like today in this moment and what does it look like to co-resist and as Israeli like Jews, as you said, like Israelis with Jewish citizenship, sorry, Jews with Israeli citizenship, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship is the Standing Together movement of kind of joint leadership. And those kinds of groups here, where there is a systemic analysis and understanding of the vastly different amount of power the Israeli state has compared to the Palestinian people, um, and are trying to picture today and in their organizing work and resistance work some kind of shared vision.
Mhm.
And for some people, though, they Standing Together was by the international like Palestinian cultural boycott movement was said, don't engage with them because they're whitewashing Israeli crimes.
Yeah.
And I'll take that critique seriously. And I read it, and then I read the response from the Palestinian leadership within Standing Together. And ultimately, I mean, on the one hand, like nobody, what I think doesn't really matter. I'm just try to show up in in I think social change happens in a multiplicity of ways, and
Yeah.
I try to show up and support in the ways that feel like
Yeah.
they make sense to me, and they tend to be more leaning towards like, how can we be practicing now the future we want? And
Mhm.
to me, I think it's hard to shift from a mentality of kind of us versus them, even as that can galvanize social change movements. I think it's hard to then pivot at some point to it all being us. And
Mhm.
so, what does it mean to actually, for me, again, without judgment of anybody else and how they approach it? Because
Mhm.
I don't know. But just for me, in terms of what I do at the individual level, when I'm working on the sort of the criminal level cases through to the social
Mhm.
change stuff,
Mhm.
is how can we root, for me, how can I root my work today in this idea of an us? And what does that look like in wanting a sort of end of peace and justice for
Mhm.
all?
Mhm.
I hope I answered your question.
Well, yes, and more. And I sort of engendered two other questions. I don't usually ask so many questions per se,
It's
but
okay.
you're sparking my curiosity and queeriness. um, One is, as you say, you don't know, I don't know, nobody knows really, God knows. perhaps what's going to happen, but um, how it's going to be resolved. But I noticed that you do call yourself, I suppose, increasingly a conflict mediator, right? Or a
Yeah.
conflict coach, a conflict coach.
Yeah, both. Yeah.
So, and you had a lot of incrementally accruing front hand, front line experience, personal, with iterations, defending people who are subjugated to injustice and so on. So there must be kind of a growing body of uh, energetic orientation within your psyche and your soul, even, I suppose, as well as your mind, towards this whole picture. So I would imagine you have a lot to offer. So the first question, I'm going to say both questions, and then you can answer however you
All
want.
right.
The first one was, if if you were a betting man, gambling man, how would you say the process of resolution and peace and justice is going to go forward, in little tiny steps, bit by bit? A little bit of authentic dialogue here and there, little groups and slightly larger ones like standing together, or is it going to be like a great uh, coming together of nations and more conflict and an outbreak of more wars, perhaps, and then settlements, like a sort of a heavy-handed negotiations, or is it going to be ecological disaster, perhaps, where nobody has food, not just the Gazans, but the Israelis and the neighboring nations too. So the second question would be, if you were named as the head mediator
Oh,
on a on a mediating committee from the best from all around the world, the East, the West, Africa, the best people, the diplomats, the scientists, the economists, the politicians, the spiritual people as well, leaders. But you are the facilitator of that committee. What would be your modus operandi, just for fun, off the top of your head, if you're given all that trust and power?
I've never been asked that question. And it feel like I can definitely feel a little bit of like imposter syndrome around like, what does it matter what I think, Hugh? And I feel honored by the question. And so I'll say what's coming to mind.
Great.
Um, I mean, I feel like I have less to say on the first one because there's a part of me that can see, like, I keep thinking like, this can't just keep going on. We can't keep having this live stream destruction of people's lives in Gaza and not and have the West in particular continue to sort of mostly ally with the Israeli state. And I don't want things to get worse, and yet they continue to. So I don't know where this is going. I don't know. I mean, all on some level, I think all wars, conflicts, they do end. Is it going to be 5, 10, 100 years in my lifetime, your lifetime? I don't know. So
Mhm.
I don't think I can answer that.
Okay.
Um,
Fair
in
enough.
terms of the second one, though, the I mean, I do think that for like a fundamental, I think about truth and reconciliation processes and whether they're at like if you I mean you can do them at scale, it's similar to what you can do with a group of people or two people. Is you try to create the conditions where each group, and it's more complicated when there's a power imbalance, but ultimately you can acknowledge that and try to have like empathy or understanding of the other person's or the other society's experience. So that's one piece, that I think would need to be essential for anything to happen. And even there's a part in my brain that's saying like, well, good luck with that. That we're so far from that, other than in little micro moments in little groups
Right.
that it almost feels silly to say. But that's true for me in terms of my understanding of humans and
Yeah.
healing and conflict and
Mhm.
violence.
Mhm.
And then another piece that's coming to mind is, and this is something that they talk about on this podcast. You would have seen Amira speak. There was at that event
Yes.
in April. Amira Mohammed is one of the hosts of a
Mhm.
podcast
Right.
called Unapologetic: The Third Narrative. And one of the things she says and her co-host Ibrahim say, they're both Palestinians with Israeli citizenship,
Mhm.
is we're not going to agree on the past, but can we agree on the future? Can
Mhm.
we understand each other's even experiences of the past without needing to agree on them?
That's
But can
beautiful.
we,
Yeah. Mhm.
believe in the future? And what that brings to mind, a friend of mine shared with me. Um, a story now. It's second or third hand, but about some restorative practices that a facilitator, and I think her name is Ishbel Monroe, who I haven't met firsthand, but is I think based in Nova Scotia, in working with some communities in conflict along a sort of uh, an indigenous and kind of like white settler background line was tensioned. And a question that was at the center, as I understand it, that really brought people together was, what do you want for your children?
Mm.
So we can't agree on the present, but like, and apparently that, at least as it was told to me in the story, was that's where there was alignment and people saw each other. And when she told my friend Rehana Tejpar told me that she saw the emotion immediately come up and she knew exactly where I went, which was whether it's here where there is tension in between the Jewish community here and the Palestinian or broader Arab or left community, or there in the land, that question, like
Mhm.
as someone who moves back and forth between these sort of poles to some extent, it's so similar. We
It's
just
yeah,
want our kids to grow up safe and with dignity and like
yeah,
to like have the joys of childhood. You know what I mean? I can feel the emotion. Like it's so simple
yes,
and yet
exactly.
also seems so far away. But to orient ourselves to our shared underlying like values and goals and separate them from the strategies we're using to meet those that are where we're having such violence.
Mhm. It is such a simple but deep question, an organic question that can pivot the conversation from
Yeah.
the past and all those injustices and resentments and so on. So, yourself being Jewish, and there are many, many Jews who are both, well, some in Israel, not enough perhaps, but in the diaspora, um, who have a variety of opinions and perceptions and orientations regarding this conflict. And it, it seems to me it's really important for this group of people internationally, the voice that people like yourself have. I'm wondering, like within your own Jewish community, even family perhaps, um, based on the way that you feel and the way that you speak about this issue, if there's like any kind of blowback or difficulties or hey, what the hell's going on here? You're betraying our people and that kind of thing. Or
Yeah, I definitely, and I think my father would be okay with me sharing this. When I first started changing my perception from how I grew up when I was about 20, so I'm 43 now. And definitely there were some real arguments with my father that were along the lines of like betraying your people and so
yeah,
on. Um, in many conversations over the years, and certainly many conversations over the last 2 years. And I actually really credit, and I think I said this at the event, that podcast.
mhm,
Ibrahim and Namir putting this podcast into the world that they were calling the third narrative. Not like just not needing to be in this polar, and they were it's specifically targeted more to an international audience, basically saying, please don't make it like the pro-Israel football team and the pro-Palestine football
yeah,
team. Like, let's not be trapped in two different stories that feel mutually
mhm,
exclusive. And I learned a lot from it. And there's moments where I found myself like I'm more critical of the Israeli government than like maybe one of the
sure,
hosts, for example.
yeah,
Which is fine.
yeah,
They wanted they said, let's just talk about it. We can disagree. Like let's just be this practice of dialogue and listening. Anyway, my a bunch of my family members really responded to it and listened to it all, and I think it provided more of a base for us to talk. And I'd like to say that at least in terms of our immediate family, with my sibling, my brother, and his wife and my parents, we're actually a family that can like talk across difference and have been able to find each other amidst this,
mm,
even though there's been some tense moments, certainly in the past and even in the last couple of years.
yeah,
Um, and at the same time, the number of stories that I hear from friends about deep, painful fractures in their families around this,
mhm, mhm,
people not talking to each other or agreeing that they won't talk about this issue ever again, the pain of that, the disconnection of that. Um, yeah, it's definitely, I mean, the people who are explicitly opposed to what Israel is doing is still, as far as I see it, at least in terms of institutional
Mm,
sort of power within the Jewish community. We're a minority voice,
mm.
but every day it is growing. I mean, the
It
polls
is
show
growing.
that
This is true.
recently, even in the last 2 weeks, some
Yeah.
statements from people who are definitely much more committed to like the state of Israel as it currently is than I am at all, and are publicly condemning it.
Yes.
Um, and I think it needs to happen.
It's as though something is
It's painful,
broken
but
in a good
yeah,
way. A beachhead has been attained, or the hundredth monkey syndrome. Just it's accumulated and accumulated.
right.
So finally, a lot of people are saying, "Hey, what the hell's going on? This ain't right." I tell you, we we got to do something. And I think there's something about this issue. Like a lot of Jewish people will say, "Well, why do you focus on Israel and Gaza? Why not? What about Sudan? There's more people killed there in the civil war, or somewhere else, or ethnic cleansing in Myanmar." But in a way, Israel and Palestine, I have a special word I use called Palesrael, Palesrael, which sort of
Mm.
combines both names. And for the day when they can be pals, right? Palesrael. Anyway, um, the
There's a Palestinian comic, I think it's Sami Obeid, who says, "I'm here to put the pal back in Palestine, or put the pal into Palestinian, or I'm like the pal in Palestinian." He's very,
yeah,
I highly recommend his
exactly.
work.
The day when there can be maybe one state, like a civic society like Canada, where everybody has equal rights before the law, whether religious, racial, whatever. Um, but um, as you say, the when it's just the duality, as a Baha'i, we sort of aim for justice and unity. Those are the two main divine attributes that are featured, not necessarily the justice of man, which, as you've experienced, can be very unjust. But fantastic that you're on the front lines there. Um, but when there's a kind of a duality, we may be at a point in our evolution of consciousness where we can start to bit by bit transcend duality and enter a valley of unity or a mountain peak of unity. Um, but there's a tension, and when you mentioned the third narrative, so if we're constantly thinking of this guy and that guy, Israel and Palestine, and the good guy and the bad guy, and whose fault it was, and it can be tormenting. There's a tremendous tension in intrinsic in a duality. So if we can have a trinity, a third element, whatever that is, then it can sort of release the creativity in the process. So do you have any ideas about what a third narrative or a third
I
participant?
can give,
You know,
yeah, I mean, definitely that, what is it, that sort of moving beyond dualism or binaries, as I sometimes say,
yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
it really resonates with me. In this particular context, I think the way I think about it is, I do think from a Palestinian perspective and just from like a historical perspective, it is important to acknowledge that there wasn't an issue until this like modern movement said, we're going to go to Palestine and we're going to start setting up settlements. Like,
Right.
regardless of what the intention was and how it may have made total sense to them to come to Palestine. And a lot of the early Zionists, like they knew there was going to be an impact on the local Palestinian Arab population, and it, a lot of them didn't care, right? And when in the Palestinian community and friends I know, like that story and that narrative, how much it's just really silenced in most parts of the at
Yeah.
least diaspora Jewish community that I grew up in, is very significant. Like there wasn't an issue until that started to happen, and then there started being, moments of like coexistence and collaboration, and then also of violence. And so, and to a point now where, I don't call this a war. This is an incredibly well-resourced army fighting a kind of band of guerrillas who have very little. Like it's not a war in my view. And so there's this wild asymmetry of power, and therefore we see why the level of destruction and death is so incredibly one-sided. At the same time, in terms of a third narrative, uh, I do think it is, for an individual who has died or lost a family member due to there's so many nonviolent forms of Palestinian
Yeah.
resistance, but there are certain ones that use violence, and who has lost a family member in that way. I think it might be hard to be like, well, yes, I lost my child,
Mhm.
but they as a group have lost so many more children. I should feel less pain. Like the pain is at the level of people
Yes.
So and I know there's Palestinian families who have lost so many family members. But when we get into the like comparing pain at that individual human level, I think we lose something. So for me, it's another kind of non-dualism is like how to both acknowledge that there's a systemic piece,
Mhm.
that there is this one army that's being supported by the strongest power in the world, the
Yes.
US. That's all true. And at the level of individual pain and suffering, that like
Mhm.
obviously Palestinian people have lost and continue to lose so much. And Israeli Jews have lost too. And Jews in the diaspora have been the targets of violence as well, as have Palestinians, of course.
Yes.
So it's like how to make space for that. And I think a good example of where that shows up, just as a very concrete example, is that very early on here in Toronto, some of the sort of more left Jewish groups, very critical of Israel, decided that they weren't going to say anything about the hostages.
Mhm.
And because very quickly the Israeli Jewish hostages, and they weren't even all Israeli or Jewish hostages, but
Right.
that's the biggest
Yeah.
group. Um, that became a rallying cry here for carte blanche for Israel to do whatever it wanted to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And and so I get why that decision was made strategically. And I think, and then interestingly, in Israel, like for the resistance within Israel itself, all they do is talk about the hostages.
Yeah.
It's the left in Israel that talks about them and says, we need the hostages back. It's only going to come through negotiation. By bombing them, you've killed some of them, you put more at risk,
Yeah.
and so on. And it's the right that doesn't talk about them. So this issue about hostages becomes in two different political contexts. One only talked about by one side, and the other only talked about by the other, which to me shows that it's about the way that narratives get developed. And there's like how do we see uh kind of beyond these stories that we feel like we need to be. It sometimes feels like I need to stick with one story or I'll lose my belonging in that one community. And there's one community or there's another community.
Mhm.
And that what brings to mind is someone close to me who's Jewish that is very much still in kind of I think a pro-Israel sort of context here in various within the Jewish community, but is not of that view anymore. And I said, like, when you hear people say things like, do you react? How does it feel? Because sometimes I'm in more like left, sort of what are called probably pro-Palestine spaces, a lot that I agree with, occasional things I don't. And I'm like, okay, well, am I going to say something? I don't know. I don't want to lose community over here either. So I asked him, and he said, yeah, it's hard. He's like, but I'm worried that I'm supposed to stand with my community and I'll lose my community if I say a different opinion. And that's what I think that fear of losing belonging, um, that fear of kind of dissenting from the people you feel like you're having community with is scary. And I think
Mhm.
it's deeply rooted and I understand it. And still, it's like if we don't take that risk or try to build spaces outside of that or whatever, like then we're just trapped.
Mhm.
And as much as the Palestinian people are suffering, so I think, like the scale is just, I mean, I feel
It's
sick about
it's
it.
almost
Uh,
unbelievable. It's hard to
Yeah, it's
fathom, isn't it?
unbelievable.
Yes.
And I don't see how Jewish peace and justice and safety, let alone Israeli Jewish, it's interlinked. I don't see how we that it needs to be like in collaboration. It needs to be seen together to see that like we can't have Palestinian safety, justice without Israeli like safety, justice. Like they can't be at odds. They have
Yeah.
to be interlinked, and it's so hard for a lot of people to see that.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, it takes courage. I'm thinking of yourself as an individual, and some of the themes we've talked about, and the way that you're positioning yourself within your career and within your community, within the world. It takes courage to. I know as a therapist, and I've known many others who work with dispossessed populations, family, domestic violence, and all kinds of areas. There's a vulnerability, and so I'm wondering, personally, do you have a way that you can kind of protect yourself from negativity, we'll say? You're dealing with situations where there is violence and persecution and injustice. And some people might get mad at you for defending those people or for sticking your nose. If so, do you have a way like a psychic self-defense or something, or spiritual prayer or whatever it is? Go out in nature, talk with
Hmm.
with friends to maintain your own equilibrium and equanimity.
Right. That's a beautiful question. Thank you. I feel like I have, similar to you said earlier, like I have I think you said we were recording, a variety of interests. I have like a variety of things that I do. I
Yeah,
feel it's somewhat eclectic. I mean, one of the, I just want to say, like, I have such an amazing group of friends and colleagues who, of many different kinds of like backgrounds and identities, who have a shared vision around this.
yeah.
I'm part of a community.
Mm,
Um, it's connected to an organization called Yes World that has seeded these
mm,
so-called jams all
mm.
around the world, and
Yeah.
it's a great community.
Mm,
But all the things we've been talking about,
mm,
about an interest, a very interest and passion for justice, and for like how do we bring everybody along and not
mm,
fall into
mhm.
binaries, again,
Yeah,
without judgment, if that's where you're at, and
yeah,
it's not
yeah.
what we're trying to focus on.
Right.
So having just like community and being able to just
Mm,
call so many people or send a voice note at 11:30 at night being like, I'm having a really hard time. Can you just
mm,
listen to me? Can you just like witness me in this moment and not freeze me? And a lot of that, just like I'm so grateful for so much community I could just reach out to for those impromptu moments.
yeah.
And then it's like I do a lot of, you know, I'll, so mindfulness practice is really trying to notice and pay attention when I'm feeling divided inside, when I'm feeling pain, when I'm feeling overwhelmed by whether it's anger or grief, and really having to have kind of like a rigorous practice of figuring out ways to move that and not get stuck in it.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
to me, a real sign that there's something in me that needs to move is when I have trouble finding empathy for quote unquote like the other, or who has
mhm,
started to seem like the other.
mhm,
And if I can't connect in with their story and try to understand how they got to where they did. And that includes, like, I mean, I've worked with people who've caused very extreme forms of violence. And when I work with them, it's not about justifying what they did, but it's trying to understand how they got to the point that that made sense.
mhm,
And
mhm.
that applies to me on the individual level, on the community level, bigger forms of violence,
Yes.
like collective violence. And if I can't tap into that because I'm feeling too much disconnection, then, I think a lot of wisdom traditions talk about, uh, and I'm thinking of a line from, his name is escaping me. It'll come. He does a lot of gang intervention work in LA. Father Greg Boyle, I think is his
Mhm,
name. And there's a line that he says, "I won't, I won't be tempted to despise the wounded if I tend to my own wounds."
mhm,
And that to me is just like that's something I really hold on to, and especially in the last 2 years, and especially in terms of moments where I have felt I've lost
mhm,
connection or compassion for people in my own Jewish community who are supporting something still that I certainly can't, and find kind of overwhelming in some moments that they still can without any qualifications, or at least that I'm seeing. And so it's like, okay, how can I come back? What's inside me that needs to be tended to, that needs to be healed,
mhm.
that I can't hold this person's humanity right now.
Beautiful. That's the itinerary, from being a normal person, just trying to make a living, getting along with your neighbors, to that kind of sociopathic or psychopathic stance that individuals can reach, and societies can as well. It's how can we take that? I'm reading this book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I'm thinking of
Oh
braiding
yeah,
all the
that's
time.
been on my reading list for a while. I haven't got there yet.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah. But the braiding somehow, or debraiding, untying the knots, mending the rift with compassion and patience and deep listening. And as you say, looking at oneself, how does this conflict over in the Middle East, how is it mirrored in my own self
Yeah,
among my different parts,
yeah.
that feel cheated or violated or not seen, not appreciated? Uh, is there a little Holocaust going on right inside me? Even though
Mm,
it's suppressed and not upfront, it might be mostly unconscious, but it plays out, it oozes out sometimes in our relationships and our health and so on. So that's really helpful. I'm just circling back to that, seeing that Israel and Palestine kind of is the center of the world in a way. If you take the three most populous continents,
right.
Europe, Asia, and Africa, they all come to that little strip of land. And my theory, the reason that the whole world, especially the Western world, from which the Jewish people came to Palestine before and after World War II, um, is so obsessed with what goes on there, um, is because it's kind of the homeland of the Judeo-Christian tradition. When I was a little kid in Sunday school, in church, they would always talk about Palestine, and you'd see people in Palestinian garbs. It's part of our cultural heritage, even though we're becoming more and more uh, not so much a religious society, more, um, but still, it's there. It's in our literature, it's in our songs, and so people care what happens there more than Malaysia, for example, a country in Africa. People from the Western world. Um, so that given, and in that the situation that which you described of another people coming in um, taking over land from a people that was already there, and that's the source of this conflict. What about some kind of, as a part of the solution, the international community of nations? Remember back in the year 2000, I think it was Canada even that helped to bring in this, what was it called? The idea that if one country is abusing a minority within its boundaries, the community of nations can come in and do something about it. Just like if, let's say, for example, a man is sexually abusing his children. In the old days, people say, "Oh, well, that's their business. We don't
Hmm.
want to even know about that." But nowadays, somebody will call the police, and there'll be a court case, quite possibly, right? So it was the same kind of idea, only on the international level. Um, do you feel that the community of nations has a big part to play, or some part to play in this resolution, or do we just leave it to the Jews and the Arabs, the Israelis and the Palestinians, or whatever you want to call it?
Just as like a minor note, there are so many Jews in Israel who either identify still as Arab or are recently
Oh,
descended from Arab Jews,
this is
right?
true.
Like,
Yeah,
that
the
that binary is an interesting one that
the
sometimes gets.
Mizrahi and the
Yeah, and
Sephardic. Yeah,
there's a whole history, like a Mizrahi and Mizrahi identity, and
yeah,
Mizrahi identity is also like a way to almost divide Arab Jews from their Arabness. Anyway, that's a whole
that's true.
complex piece,
That's
just
a
to
very
name,
interesting
trying to
side
be like non-dualistic.
discussion. Yeah, yeah,
Uh, but in terms of the bigger question, yeah, I want to just acknowledge, to go back to your earlier piece. It's I like hearing I mean, like it's a weird word, but the sort of Judeo-Christian, and then obviously Islam as well, like having such deep roots in that land.
yeah.
Why the West cares in it,
Hmm.
because I think I tend a little bit more, as you noted, maybe to like the geopolitical settler aspect. That that I think, my understanding of the roots of Zionism, modern political secular Zionism, was sort of looking, oh, well, we've watched how these other countries have gone to other parts of the world and set up settlements and what that looks like, and
Yeah,
carrying some
exactly.
of that,
Why
so like
can't we
that's,
do the same thing?
and we do the same, we being like sort of, I mean, white settler, I don't think it's a coincidence why Israel has the allies that it does. Let's put it that way. In terms of like also oil-rich region, like all these geopolitical things and another layer that you're adding, I think may well be important for understanding the story about just like the meeting place of these different continents, and it being a place of just import for
Yes,
centuries and centuries. And it's obviously this like this sort of, I'm not a historian, but Crusades come to mind as kind of like there's so much,
yeah, at different stages.
Anyway,
Well, guilt may have something to do with it. When you
what's
look at
that?
the guilt,
Guilt.
World War
Right,
II, when
right.
you look at the nations of Europe, the one that has been most supportive of Israel
Right.
in this reason has been Germany.
Right.
Interesting.
Recently looking into, though, an arms embargo.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. There's
so a
changes
friend of
there
mine
too.
who I didn't actually even know this experience, who's German, shared with me how much actually her upbringing, not Jewish at all, was so similar to mine in terms of a very one-sided presentation of the history of Israel and Palestine, or again, probably leaving out Palestine for these reasons that I think I know very little about German society, but it I only learned that in the last year and it made sense and was surprising and made sense.
Strangely, it
Um,
has the fastest growing Jewish population of any country in Europe. They're building
really.
new synagogues every 3 months. Yeah,
Um,
a lot
but
of
what was your
Israelis
question? I feel
actually.
like I lost your question in there, Hugh.
Well, that
There
wasn't a
was,
question. No, it was
but
just
there's something.
an
Yeah, I don't know.
observation. Well, this is the observation that maybe guilt of the European
Right.
nations uh, after World War
Could be
II.
another layer.
Yeah, a
Another
layer
layer.
of for the understanding, the rationale, for this strong support of Israel in this conflict.
I also think racism is another layer. Like,
Absolutely,
I
yeah,
mean, even as ch- I just went to the Auschwitz exhibit at the ROM, like here, the local biggest museum in Toronto,
yes,
and was reminded how much I mean, I knew this growing up and I've known this, but like the framing of Jews as like subhuman and an other, and certainly not as white. And um, I do think that there is, because of the identification with Europe in terms of the original movement and then who the allies have become and so on, um, as much as racially Israeli Jews are actually quite mixed in a lot of ways,
hmm
I don't, I think the fact that this is like uh, a country that's allied with countries in which sort of like the privilege of white skin is so dominant still, and the Palestinians as in general like darker skinned and all that, and like Muslim, like not, majority Muslim and all this, like there's an othering, there's a racism that feels like another layer of why we're building layers here to explain what we're seeing. And oh yeah, your question is about intervention. I don't
yes,
know enough
oh,
about international law, and obviously you don't want to intervene in a way that's just like, I don't think it's going to lead to a lasting solution for violence to stop violence to stop violence. Maybe it is, but that's obviously not my framing. And again, I don't know the answer. But yeah, I'm desperate for the international community to do something
hmm
meaningful. But my underst it's the US that blocks that. It's other
yeah,
Western European countries, Canada, that
obviously,
blocks that, and it's
right.
it's devastating to me. And I feel the like anger and frustration that a lot of my Palestinian friends and other people who are
hmm
engaged feel around the hypocrisy of talking about freedom and democracy
yes,
and rights for all. And then just like at this point, starting to issue some statements, but with
hmm
no teeth, with nothing concrete. And
exactly.
it grinds on, and people are dying and starving. And,
hmm
Israel's like leading human rights organization, B'Tselem, just acknowledged this is our genocide. We are perpetuating a genocide right now, as hard as it is
absolutely,
to
yeah,
accept. And
absolutely.
anyway, I'm gutted by
The
the whole thing.
responsibility to protect, that was the name of
Yeah,
that millennial, not
right.
legislation, and it was
Where
quite
is
exciting
that?
at the time. Yeah. That
And
idea
what?
that
Yeah.
it's in large part, the community of nations that caused this. So maybe they should, I mean, through the United Nations or another evolved institution, but in some way, um, the region needs some help, obviously.
Yeah.
And thanks be to you and others of your ilk. Um, I would love to keep talking for another 2 hours, but we've gone actually longer than usually these little conversations last because it's just so damn interesting. You have a lot of feathers in your bonnet, tricks up your sleeve, and a lot of experience that you're lending to this and many other areas. So I would encourage people to check out your website. There's a lot of information on there, including some of the books that are inspiring you these days,
Mhm.
including that one by, what was his name?
Kazu
Uh,
Haga.
Kazuhaga. Yeah, great. Well, Jeff, is there any one last thing that you'd like to share before we say
No, it was
shalom?
yeah, shalom. Wishing for that, wishing for shalom salam, for peace.
hmm
As far away as that seems in this moment. No, I appreciate being asked the questions and being invited here to speak about this. It's not, I mean, I talk about it all the time, and I do feel aware when I'm speaking for an audience. I don't know who's going to listen to this. So maybe I'll speak to that audience and say, if you got this far, thank you for listening. Um, if you noticed that there were things that you disagreed with what I said, that's okay.
Right.
I'm doing my best. I'm sure you're doing your best.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
hope you can have understanding for where I'm coming from and knowing that I'm not holding these with like that I'm right or correct. I'm just trying to figure things out as best as I can. And I trust you're doing the same.
Hmm. Well, thanks very much for your focus, your presence, your sincerity, and your service. It's really, really inspiring. And do come back again sometime, would you?
Well, invite me back.
Yeah, okay, great.
Thanks for
We'll
doing this,
continue the
Hugh.
conversation. Yeah,
It's a great endeavor.
yeah. Okay. Thanks again. Bye, Jeff.